If you stayed up until 1 a.m. and then watched the whole way through until 3 a.m., bravo, I commend you. You are a true, devoted, possibly slightly deranged, obsessed Aston Villa fan. And this isn't going to be a very long show, and I'm not changing my stance. We don't want to read too much into the preseason, but there are a couple of lingering trends that I think are worth exploring. Let's get into it. RB Leipzig 2, Aston Villa 0. It's so nice to have you back inside the parlor, even though that was a thud. And you know, when Villa announced the Columbus date for the preseason tour, I did wonder, are they going to have more games in and around the Eastern Seaboard? And I said to my sons, you know, if they go to New York, we got to go because it's an amazing city. And sure enough, New York and Chicago were added, and I was very tempted to go to all three. But a nagging voice inside my head said, save the budget for England. Thank goodness. And if you were one of the fans who traveled all the way across the Atlantic or from outside the Eastern Seaboard to watch these last two games, again, fair play to you. Before we get into the relevant nuts and bolts of what happened at Red Bull Arena, a couple of corrections from my Columbus Crew review. And the first one is that Tyrone Mings has another year left on his deal after this season. So his deal will expire on June 30th, 2026, which is good news, gives him a little bit more wiggle room, but it doesn't really look like we're going to see the big man until at least mid-September. Chris Heck said in a recent interview that all the commercial and marketing operations within the club are now in-house under the Aston Villa roof, so they're in control of it. They had to ditch a lot of really bad vendor contracts. But they did not, as I had said in the last show, produce the kit launch video. That responsibility actually went to Adidas, which kind of makes sense because they had to get rights to Ozzy Osbourne and his music. And they engaged with an agency called Homeground, which actually has as their creative director a diehard Villa fan in Johnny Marsh, which is great news and which is why it has that Aston Villa flavor. I mean, I'm sure they would have consulted with the club, but bravo to Adidas and to Homeground because that video is still racking up the views across all the social channels. I did not have a correspondent at Red Bull Arena in Harrison, New Jersey, but this always was one of my favorite venues during my MLS commentary career, partially because the media facilities were top notch and the VIP experience for fans was, I think, second to none in MLS. This was one of Chris Heck's former homes, and they had to work really hard here because it's a trek out to Harrison, and they needed to attract both fans and media to try to stay relevant in what is, of course, a very saturated sports market and not right in the middle of Manhattan. I keep having to remind myself that we are without three critical members of our team in Emi Martinez, Ollie Watkins, and Ezri Konza, who make up a big part of our personality and just under a third of our actual starting group. But still, there should be enough among the rest to have a competitive game against an RB Leipzig team that was playing its first preseason game. Yes, they are in pot one of the Champions League teams. And given how testy that game turned out, wouldn't it be something if we were drawn against them in the CL? 2 years ago, under the tutelage of Steven Gerrard, we had what you could call almost a flawless preseason between Australia and then that last tune-up game in France, and we all know what happened after that. And then last year, Unai Emery's first preseason with us, also very few blemishes. Now, the regular season didn't start the best, but here we are. We're preparing for Champions League football. The point is, preseason is not a harbinger for what could come. But I can't help but feel, watching these last two games and also just looking at the squad, there are some lingering trends and issues that I'm slightly worried about. And I realize that it won't be often during the upcoming season that Aston Villa will play in 34 Celsius heat with 50% humidity. It saps you when you have to play and train in that and you're not used to it. It'll help you prepare for the season, but we're not used to it. Columbus is. They play in those conditions all the time. Most MLS teams do. So does Club America, who we meet on Saturday. But RB Leipzig is also not used to it, and they looked fresher than we did, despite the fact that was their first game and our fourth. Lingering issue number 4, the majority of goals we've conceded this preseason have been self-inflicted. And I actually could see a positive side to that, in that our opponents aren't actually breaking us down all that easily, at least not around or through us. Where we have problems, it seems, is over the top, something we've become accustomed to under Unai Emery with the high line. But let's factor no Emi Martinez, because his starting position in those circumstances is usually pretty good. We're missing Ezri Konsa, who's quick as a bunny to recover. And then Ollie Watkins is good at accepting a long ball and holding it up for us time to time. And then with Amadou Onana, we're not paying $50 million for him to be sitting on the bench at West Ham. And this is a new player in a new system, and he's trying to figure out that breakout where the central defender tries to slither the pass through to him to then get the attack moving through the middle third. But on the negative side, the question has to be asked, why are we so untidy, especially when we're being pressed? Because we're used to all that. Now, you could make a case that Ross Barkley was fouled prior to the 1-0 goal, because it sure looked like he was, but he didn't really make a fuss. But prior to the 2-0 goal, what is Diego Carlos doing? He's not marking anybody, and more worrisome still, he doesn't look fussed about not marking anybody. And as much as I love our chiseled Brazilian's delivery of pass, because he could spin it right into the exact place that a teammate wants to receive it, job number 1 is about defending. And for Diego Carlos, I'm sorry, at his time at Aston Villa, it has not been good enough. Everything about that 2-0 goal was so passive. It was almost as if it was in slow motion. What happened after that, though, was also really poor. And Openda made a meal out of it, obviously, just like he did the first one that drew a yellow card for Carlos. And maybe Diego thought it's a preseason tune-up game. The referee's not going to go to that extreme or have the nerve to pull out a second yellow card, but it really spoiled the attack part of our preparations, exacerbated by the fact that we didn't have a proper center forward. So we spent the better part of 48 minutes shifting from side to side, awful, ugly work in 34 Celsius heat and 50% humidity. I guess the one positive is that we didn't concede another goal in that second half. Look at me. I cared so little about this show, I didn't even bother to shave. Now, if I was living in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, I could just go to Alex's barbershop and get a straight razor shave with a hot towel. It's one of the nicest things a dude can have. And in case you missed it, Alex's was completely refurbished by this show's presenting sponsor, 24/7 Services, in 2 weeks. You might have seen the video with Jay, the painter, showing you around at all the changes that were made in such little time. And just look at what it means to Alex, the guy that the shop is built around. I mean, you can have the nicest looking walls and chairs. If the haircuts aren't good, it doesn't matter. This guy is who this shop is all about, because he cuts a good head of hair. So the moral of the story is, if you want to refresh your business in a quick time, and dramatically so, talk to Paul and his team at 24/7 Services. And if you need a shave and a haircut, go visit Alex's in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield. I'm starting to wonder if another very mobile and athletic right-footed center back is higher on Monchi's priority list than we might have imagined earlier this window. And without knowing when Tyrone Mings is going to be back, as it doesn't look like it's going to be until at least mid-September earliest, whether we need cover for Pau Torres, and all these Mario Hermoso links that we've had for months have suddenly all quieted down, and supposedly he's looking for way too high a wage packet. But this is where now in the window you got to look at your priorities by position and maybe, adjust a little bit as the season and the end of the window approaches. Lingering issue number 3, punctuated by Robin Olsen's first half injury, but the drop-off from Emi Martinez to the next goalkeeper is still too wide for me. And I realize this is a really tricky issue that the club doesn't want to pour a ton of resources into, but this is the problem with having the best goalkeeper in the world. Who on earth would want to back up Emi Martinez knowing he's going to play 95% of the games? Robin Olsen is worth at least one errand pass per game, guaranteed. I mean, that's the biggest thing we miss when we don't have Dibu between the sticks. He has become so tidy on the football. And neither Oliver Zeitch nor Joe Gauchi are really filling me with a whole bunch of confidence, at least at this minute in time. Lingering issue number 2, we are without Ollie Watkins. I mean, here we are just over 2 weeks until the Premier League season kicks off, and apart from Cameron Archer, we have no real legitimate cover for Oliver Watkins. Bless Morgan Rogers and Emi Buendia for trying, but like the goalkeeping situation, what ambitious young number 9 type would want to come to Villa knowing that they might have to sit on the bench, which is why we must find somebody who can also play with Ollie Watkins along with, at times, instead of Ollie Watkins. The latest name was Jean-Philippe Mateta at Crystal Palace. And my number 1 lingering fear is, have we improved our first 11? Douglas Luiz and Moussa Diaby are gone, and so are a lot of goals, and goals that they helped set up. Now, we did acquire Amadou Onana, and I believe that is a profile player that we've needed for a long time, a physically robust ball winner that can play defensively and also as a two-way player. When Boubacar Kamara comes back and with Enzo Barrenechea in the meantime, I think we're pretty good in that role. And the one thing about Luiz that I noticed, and maybe you did as well, is that when Kamara was in the lineup, it gave him the freedom to go forward and take more risks downfield. Same goes for John McGinn and Yuri Tielemans and maybe even a Ross Barkley or whoever plays in the middle of the park. As a squad, obviously, we have more players, we have more options, and we've become younger. And to use a time-worn cliche, Jacob Ramsey and Emi Buendia are like new signings for us. And by the way, Jacob Ramsey showed a couple of very classy moments in difficult circumstances, despite the fact that he only got about 25 minutes. So we have more players, we have more competition for places, but have we upgraded our first 11? Like, for example, is Ian Matson a clear upgrade on Luca Dean? Totally different kinds of players, different ingredients. Okay, and again, considering who's missing, we still have a lot of options in this squad, which I would have thought would have increased the competition for places and probably increased the standard a little bit, and it seems like the opposite has occurred here, at least in the first 2 games of this USA tour, and maybe that's just from a lack of cohesion. There isn't an established first 11, and in places where there are sort of more senior players, I'm worried that the drop down to the next player is just a little bit too wide right now. I have no worries at all that Unai Emery isn't going to get the very most out of some of these high potential young players that we've recruited this summer, but they need to play. And, apart from some League Cup games down the road, where are they going to play? Not really much to report on the transfer front, although there was this rumor that we offered Chelsea $58 million for Conor Gallagher, and he said no. And now Gallagher is apparently off to La Liga to play with Atletico Madrid for a substantially smaller transfer fee. Apparently, it's entirely up to him and his camp, and that's the club that Joao Felix wants to exit from and avoid having to go to Hong Kong with for their preseason. I just wonder if those two situations are somehow connected, maybe. But here we are. It's the last month of the transfer season. The pressure is on now, and as I said earlier, I still wonder if we're going to address the goals that we've lost with Diaby and Luiz. Speaking of Spain there, I highly recommend you watch the Netflix series La Liga All Access, an 8-episode docuseries that chronicles this last season. It reminds me a little bit of this series from about 5 years ago called Six Dreams. Also, a beautiful insight into Spanish football. Joao Felix is featured, of course, with Barcelona, a club that has just gone through a catastrophe financially, which was already evident last year. But I also learned a ton about Basque Country, where Unai Emery is from, starting with the fact that the weather there is actually closer to Birmingham than it is to Madrid and Barcelona. It rains a lot. It's cloudy a lot. But it is astonishing, this Athletic Club that Nico Williams plays for, a team that is made up entirely of Basque players from the local region, and yet they manage to stay competitive. It's almost like a cult, and we're actually playing them when we return from the USA tour. Yeah, I know it was a shorter review than usual, but what do you say about a game like that? Sloppy, disjointed. One game left in this leg of preseason preparations. That's Saturday in Chicago against Club America from Liga MX. They just lost 3-0 to Chelsea on Wednesday in Atlanta, so I'll be very curious to know if Unai Emery can get our group to snap out of it, be assertive, and just a little bit more tidy in everything we do. Until the weekend, be well, and as always, up the mighty Villa.